Before the golden gates gleamed and fountains danced, Versailles was just a swamp, a quiet, muddy hunting lodge lost in the woods. Tonight, we slip behind the grand chandeliers and silk curtains to uncover how one king's ambition, thousands of aching hands, turned a forgotten forest into the most famous palace in the world, from marshes to marble. This is the slow, glittering story of how Versailles truly came to life. If softly told stories of royal dreams and quiet labor help ease your mind, you're in the perfect place. Subscribe now and tap the bell icon to drift into the forgotten corners of history's grandest places, one peaceful story at a time. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it for you right now? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You stand in the thick forests of Versailles in the early morning mist of 1607, watching as a 6-year-old boy named Louis pulls his small horse to a halt beside his father, King Henry IV. The child's eyes scan the marshlands and wooded hills with the intensity of someone far beyond his years. This moment, unremarkable as it might seem, would eventually reshape the very landscape of France and alter the course of European history. The boy who would become Louis XIII had discovered something in these unremarkable woods southwest of Paris. While his father chatted with the hunting party about the abundance of game, young Louis was already imagining something different. The terrain here was challenging, marshy in places, thick with ancient oak and beech trees that had stood for centuries. Wild boar roamed freely through the underbrush, and deer paths crisscrossed the forest floor like a natural highway system. It was, by all accounts, perfect hunting territory. Henry IV, despite his reputation as a skilled military commander and shrewd politician, probably gave little thought to this particular hunting expedition. He had dozens of such trips each year, and the forests around Paris offered numerous suitable locations. But young Louis seemed different that day. The servants noted how he lingered when others were ready to return to the Louvre, how he asked detailed questions about the land ownership and the local villages. Even at 6 years old, there was something calculating in his manner, something that suggested he was already thinking beyond the immediate pleasure of the hunt. The landscape itself was unremarkable by royal standards. Unlike the grand chateau that dotted the Loire Valley or the impressive fortifications that guarded France's borders, this area offered no architectural marvels or strategic advantages. The nearest settlement was a small village called Versailles. Its name derived from the Latin Versailles, meaning place that has been turned or plowed land. The village consisted of perhaps 200 souls, mostly farmers and craftsmen who worked the land under the feudal system that still governed much of rural France. What made this location special was not what was there, but what wasn't. The land was relatively flat, offering excellent sightlines for hunting. The marshes provided natural water features that could be developed, and the proximity to Paris, roughly 11 miles to the northeast, made it accessible without being too close to the capital's noise and politics. For a young prince who would grow up to value both privacy and control, these factors would prove tremendously important. The hunting party that day included not just the king and his son, but also a small army of courtiers, servants, and guards. The logistics of moving such a group required careful planning. Horses had to be prepared and provisions packed. Royal hunt was never a simple affair. It was a complex operation that demonstrated the king's wealth, power, and organizational capabilities. Every detail, from the quality of the horses to the intricacy of the hunting costumes, served to reinforce the social hierarchy that kept the monarchy at its apex. Young Louis absorbed these lessons even as he enjoyed the thrill of the chase. He watched how his father commanded respect through both his presence and his careful attention to protocol. He saw how the courtiers competed for the king's attention, how a word of praise or criticism could alter someone's status instantly. The hunt was not merely recreation. was a masterclass in royal power and its exercise. The forests around Versailles had been hunting grounds for centuries. Medieval kings had ridden through these same woods, pursuing the same game that now fled before Henry IV's party. But the techniques of hunting had evolved considerably. The use of trained dogs, the development of more sophisticated firearms, and the elaborate rituals that surrounded the royal hunt had all reached new levels of refinement. These hunts were carefully choreographed events where the king's skill as a hunter reinforced his image as a natural leader. As the day progressed, Louis XIII's fascination with the location only deepened. He asked questions about the soil quality, the water sources, and the local weather patterns. Even the servants began to notice his unusual interest. While other young nobles might have focused solely on the excitement of the hunt, Louis seemed to be conducting a careful survey of the terrain. He was, unknowingly, already planning his future. The return journey to Paris that evening gave Louis time to reflect on what he had experienced. The forests had offered him something that the formal gardens and grand halls of the Louvre could not: a sense of ownership and possibility. Here, away from the established protocols and ancient traditions that governed court life, he could imagine creating something entirely new. The seed of an idea was planted that day, though it would take years to germinate and decades to reach full flower. What Louis couldn't have known, as his horse carried him back toward the lights of Paris, was that his fascination with this particular landscape would eventually consume vast fortunes, employ thousands of workers, and create what would become the most famous palace in the world. The marshes and forests that had charmed him as a child would be completely transformed, reshaped by human ambition and royal power into something that would make the original landscape virtually unrecognizable. But such grand transformations were still far in the future. For now, there was only a young prince who had discovered a place that spoke to his imagination, a place where he could envision himself as a master of all he surveyed. The hunting lodge that would eventually rise from these woods would be modest by later standards, but it would represent something revolutionary: a royal residence designed not for defense or display, but for the simple pleasure of a king who had found his perfect retreat. What mysteries would this unremarkable landscape reveal as it slowly transformed from wilderness into the seat of absolute power? 16 years had passed since that first hunting expedition, and Louis XIII had grown from a curious child into a king grappling with the complexities of ruling 17th century France. The year was 1623, and the forests of Versailles had called to him repeatedly during those intervening years. Each visit had reinforced his conviction that this particular landscape held possibilities that nowhere else could offer. The decision to build at Versailles was not made lightly. Louis XIII had inherited a kingdom torn by religious conflicts, noble rebellions, and financial difficulties. The construction of a new royal residence required not just enormous financial resources, but also the political will to pursue a long-term project while dealing with immediate crises. Yet something about Versailles had captured the king's imagination so completely that he was willing to commit to this ambitious undertaking. The first challenge was acquiring the land. The feudal system that governed property ownership in France made this a complex process. Louis XIII needed to negotiate with multiple landowners, each of whom held different types of rights to various portions of the territory. Some owned the land itself, others held hunting rights, and still others had traditional privileges that had been passed down through generations. The king's agents spent months working through these tangled legal relationships, gradually assembling the parcels of land that would become the foundation of Versailles. The negotiations revealed the intricate social fabric of rural France. Small farmers who had worked the same plots for generations suddenly found themselves dealing with royal representatives. Local nobles who had held minor titles and traditional privileges discovered that their ancient rights were being subsumed into a grander royal vision. The village of Versailles itself had to be partly relocated to accommodate the new construction, a process that required careful attention to the needs and concerns of the displaced residents. Louis XIII's choice of master mason was crucial to the project's success. Nicolas Vaux was not the most famous architect in France, but he had demonstrated particular skill in working with challenging terrain. The marshy conditions at Versailles required innovative building techniques and careful attention to drainage. Vaux's experience with similar projects made him the logical choice for this pioneering effort. The design of the first hunting lodge was deliberately modest. Louis XIII wanted a retreat that would provide comfort and privacy without overwhelming the natural landscape. The building would be constructed of red brick with limestone trim, materials that were both practical and aesthetically pleasing. The red brick would weather well in the climate around Paris, while the limestone provided elegant, architectural details that elevated the structure above the level of a simple, country house. The lodge itself consisted of just 26 rooms, a dramatic contrast to the vast palace that would eventually grow from this humble beginning. There were apartments for the king and his closest companions, service areas for the staff, and specialized spaces for the maintenance of hunting equipment. The design emphasized function over grandeur, though care was taken to ensure that every detail reflected the dignity appropriate to a royal residence. The construction process began in earnest in 1624. The site had to be extensively prepared before any building could commence. The natural marshes were drained through a system of ditches and channels that would become the foundation for the elaborate water features that would later characterize Versailles. The uneven terrain was leveled and stabilized, a process that required moving enormous quantities of earth and stone. The logistics of construction in the 17th century were formidable. All materials had to be transported to the site by horse-drawn cart over roads that were often little more than muddy tracks. The red brick was manufactured at nearby kilns, while the limestone had to be quarried and transported from sites dozens of miles away. The skilled craftsmen needed for the specialized work stonemasons, carpenters, glaziers, and metalworkers had to be recruited from across the region and housed near the construction site. The workforce that assembled at Versailles represented a cross-section of French society. Master craftsmen commanded high wages and respect, while common laborers worked for subsistence wages under difficult conditions. The skilled workers brought with them techniques and traditions that had been passed down through generations, but they also had to adapt to the unique challenges presented by this particular project. The construction proceeded at a pace that would seem glacial by modern standards. Each phase of the work had to be completed before the next could begin. The foundation stones had to be precisely positioned and allowed to settle before walls could be raised. The walls had to be completed and the roof installed before interior work could commence. Weather delays were common and the project had to be suspended entirely during the harsh winter months when outdoor work became impossible. Louis XIII took an active interest in every aspect of the construction. He visited the site regularly, often staying for days at a time in temporary accommodations while he supervised the work. His attention to detail was legendary among the workers, and many stories were told of his willingness to discuss technical problems with master craftsmen and to consider their suggestions for improvements to the design. The king's involvement in the construction process revealed important aspects of his personality and his vision for the monarchy. Unlike many of his contemporaries who were content to issue orders and await results, Louis XIII seemed to understand that the creation of something truly remarkable required personal commitment and attention to detail. He wanted to understand not just what was being built, but how and why it was being built in particular ways. The hunting lodge was completed in 1634, 10 years after construction had begun. The finished building was modest by royal standards, but it represented something. New in French architecture, a royal residence designed primarily for personal pleasure rather than public display. The lodge's proportions were harmonious, its materials were of the highest quality, and its setting in the carefully maintained landscape created an atmosphere of refined tranquility that was unique among royal residences. The completion of the lodge marked only the beginning of what would become a centuries-long transformation of the Versailles landscape. Louis XIII could not have imagined that his modest hunting retreat would eventually become the foundation for the most spectacular palace in Europe. But he had established the principles that would guide that transformation: attention to detail, integration with the natural landscape, and an unwavering commitment to excellence in every aspect of design and construction. What forces would drive the next phase of Versailles evolution from simple retreat to the center of royal power? The hunting lodge of Louis XIII stood complete in the summer of 1634. Its red brick walls warming in the afternoon sun as servants prepared for another royal visit. The king had achieved his vision of a perfect retreat, but the creation of this modest palace had unleashed forces that would prove impossible to contain. The very success of the lodge as a royal residence had begun to attract attention from courtiers, foreign dignitaries, and ambitious nobles who saw opportunity in the king's obvious affection for this particular place. The influence of the hunting lodge extended far beyond its modest physical boundaries. The king's regular visits to Versailles had created a new rhythm in the life of the French court. When Louis XIII was in residence, important decisions were made in the lodge's small reception rooms rather than in the grand halls of the Louvre. This shift in the geography of power did not go unnoticed by the hundreds of courtiers, ministers, and foreign ambassadors who depended on royal access for their livelihoods and ambitions. The lodge's success as a royal residence had also demonstrated the potential of the Versailles site. The carefully drained marshes had been transformed into formal gardens that showcased the possibilities of large-scale landscape design. The stable blocks that housed the horses needed for hunting expeditions had grown into substantial structures that could accommodate not just animals, but also the servants and equipment needed to support extended royal visits. What had begun as a simple hunting retreat was already evolving into something more complex and ambitious. Louis XIII's son, the future Louis XIV, had spent considerable time at Versailles during his childhood. Born in 1638, 4 years after the lodge's completion, the young prince had grown up understanding that this place held special significance for his father. The elaborate hunting expeditions, the intimate dinner parties, and the relaxed atmosphere of the lodge had all contributed to young Louis's education in the possibilities of royal power when freed from the constraints of traditional court life. The boy who would become the Sun King had absorbed important lessons during those childhood visits to Versailles. He had seen how architecture and landscape could be used to create specific moods and experiences. He had observed how the physical environment of the lodge encouraged different types of social interaction than were possible in the formal settings of Paris. Most importantly, he had witnessed his father's obvious pleasure in creating and controlling every aspect of this particular environment. The hunting lodge had also served as a testing ground for ideas about royal architecture and court life that would prove influential for generations. The integration of interior and exterior spaces, the use of natural light to create dramatic effects, and the careful attention to sightlines and spatial relationships all reflected a sophisticated understanding of how physical design could support royal authority. These innovations would later be expanded and refined on a much grander scale. The staff required to maintain the lodge and support royal visits had grown substantially since the building's completion. What had begun as a small group of caretakers had evolved into a complex organization that included gardeners, stable masters, cooks, servants, and security personnel. The logistics of coordinating their efforts had created new systems and procedures that would prove valuable when applied to much larger operations. The success of the hunting lodge had also attracted the attention of artists, craftsmen, and intellectuals, who saw opportunities to advance their careers by contributing to the king's favorite project. The lodge's relatively modest scale made it an ideal laboratory for experimenting with new techniques and approaches that might later be applied to more ambitious undertakings. The walls of the lodge became a gallery for testing new decorative schemes, and the gardens served as an experimental space for innovative landscape design. The death of Louis XIII in 1643 marked a crucial turning point in the history of Versailles. The young Louis XIV, only 5 years old at the time of his father's death, would spend his childhood under the regency of his mother, Anne of Austria. The hunting lodge continued to be maintained and occasionally used, but it was no longer the focus of royal attention. The building stood as a testament to one king's vision, waiting to discover what role it might play in the reign of his successor. The Regency period allowed time for reflection on what had been achieved at Versailles and what might be possible in the future. The lodge had proven that royal architecture could be both intimate and impressive, that landscape design could enhance rather than compete with architectural achievement, and that new models of court life were not only possible but potentially superior to traditional approaches. These lessons would not be forgotten. The young Louis XIV's education included regular visits to Versailles, where he was encouraged to understand and appreciate what his father had accomplished. The boy showed an early aptitude for the visual arts and demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how physical environments could be designed to create specific experiences. His tutors noted his particular interest in the technical aspects of construction and his ability to envision how existing structures might be modified or expanded. The hunting lodge had also established Versailles as a place of royal significance. In the minds of foreign observers, diplomatic correspondence from the period reveals that other European courts were paying attention to the innovations being pioneered at this modest French palace. The integration of architecture and landscape, the attention to detail in both construction and decoration, and the new models of court life being developed. They were all noted and discussed by those who sought to understand the evolving nature of royal power in France. The financial records from the lodge's construction and maintenance provide fascinating insights into the economic impact of royal building projects. The initial construction had required significant investment, but the ongoing costs of maintenance, staffing, and regular improvements had created a steady stream of economic activity that benefited craftsmen, suppliers, and service providers throughout the region. The lodge had become not just a royal residence, but an economic engine that supported dozens of families and businesses. The architectural legacy of Louis XIII's hunting lodge would prove more influential than anyone could have imagined in 1634. The building's proportions, its relationship to the surrounding landscape, and its integration of public and private spaces would all serve as inspiration for the much grander palace that would eventually envelop it. The red brick and limestone construction would be preserved and incorporated into later expansions, creating a visual reminder of the modest origins of what would become Europe's most spectacular royal residence. As Louis XIV approached his majority and began to take active control of his kingdom, the hunting lodge at Versailles stood ready to play whatever role the young king might envision for it. The building had demonstrated the potential of the site, established the principles that would guide future development, and created the infrastructure needed to support much more ambitious projects. The seeds of grandeur had been planted and carefully tended. Now they awaited the gardener who would bring them to full flower. What vision would the young Sun King bring to this inheritance from his father? And how would it transform not just Versailles, but the very nature of royal power in France? The year was 1661, and Louis XIV had just assumed personal control of his kingdom after the death of his chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin. At 23 years old, the young king possessed an energy and ambition that would reshape not only France, but the entire European conception of royal power. As he stood in the modest hunting lodge his father had built at Versailles, Louis XIV was already envisioning something far grander than the red brick retreat that surrounded him. The transformation of Versailles from hunting lodge to palace of unprecedented magnificence would require the coordination of thousands of workers, the expenditure of vast fortunes, and the development of entirely new techniques in architecture, engineering, and landscape design. The project would consume nearly 50 years of Louis XIV's reign and establish standards of royal grandeur that would influence palace design throughout Europe and beyond. The king's first major decision was the selection of his architectural team. Louis Lvov, already renowned for his work on the chateau at Vaux-le-Vicomte, was chosen as the principal architect. Lvov brought with him not only exceptional design skills, but also the experience of managing complex, large-scale construction projects. His ability to coordinate the work of multiple specialists would prove crucial to the success of the Versailles project. Working alongside Lvov was Charles Lebrun, the first painter to the king and director of the Gobelins manufactory. Lebrun's role extended far beyond traditional artistic work. He was responsible for the overall decorative scheme of the palace and the coordination of all interior design elements. His vision would unify the work of dozens of craftsmen and artists, creating a coherent aesthetic that would define the French decorative arts for generations. The third member of the core team was André Lantré, the landscape architect, who would transform the marshy terrain around Versailles into the most sophisticated garden design in Europe. Lantré's work would extend over thousands of acres, incorporating not just formal gardens, but also forests, water features, and distant vistas that would create a landscape worthy of the Sun King's ambitions. The initial phase of construction began in 1661 with the expansion of Louis XIII's hunting lodge. Rather than demolishing his father's work, Louis XIV chose to preserve and incorporate it into his grander vision. The original lodge would become the heart of the new palace, its red brick and limestone construction, serving as a visual reminder of the building's modest origins, even as it was surrounded by structures of unprecedented scale and magnificence. Vauve's first major addition was the envelope, a new structure that wrapped around three sides of the original hunting lodge. This addition more than doubled the size of the building and created the basic framework for what would become the palace's central block. The envelope was constructed of cream-colored limestone, creating a dramatic contrast with the red brick of the original lodge while maintaining architectural harmony through careful attention to proportions and details. The construction process required the development of new techniques for managing large-scale building projects. The workforce at Versailles grew to include over 30,000 people at peak construction periods, making it one of the largest construction sites in European history. The logistics of coordinating this vast army of workers required unprecedented organizational skills and systems. The workers themselves represented every level of French society and craft tradition. Master masons who had trained for decades in traditional techniques worked alongside innovative engineers who were pioneering new approaches to construction. Skilled carpenters, metalworkers, glaziers, and decorative artists all contributed their expertise to the project. The scale of the work required not just individual skill, but also the ability to collaborate effectively with dozens of other specialists. The material requirements for the construction were staggering. Limestone had to be quarried from sites throughout the region and transported to Versailles by horse-drawn cart. The finest marble was imported from Italy, while exotic woods came from French colonies in the Americas and Asia. The quantities involved were so large that they affected markets throughout Europe, driving up prices for luxury construction materials and creating new trade relationships. The financial cost of The construction was enormous, consuming a significant portion of the French royal budget for decades. Exact figures are difficult to determine, but historians estimate that the total cost of building and maintaining Versailles represented approximately 25% of France's annual revenue during the peak construction years. These expenditures created both opportunities and challenges for the French economy, stimulating industries related to construction and decoration while straining the royal treasury. The engineering challenges presented by the Versailles site were formidable. The marshy terrain required extensive drainage work and the installation of sophisticated foundation systems. The clay soil was unstable, requiring innovative techniques for supporting the enormous weight of the new structures. The water supply for the palace and gardens required the construction of elaborate systems of pipes, pumps, and reservoirs that represented the cutting edge of hydraulic engineering. The construction schedule was driven by the king's desire to use Versailles for important state functions as soon as possible. This created constant pressure to complete different sections of the work, while other areas were still under construction. The palace was simultaneously a construction site and a functioning royal residence, requiring careful coordination to ensure that building work did not interfere with court life. The first major milestone in the construction was the completion of the new royal apartments in 1668. These rooms, designed by Lavoie and decorated by Lebrun, established the standard of magnificence that would characterize the entire palace. The king's bedroom, with its elaborate ceiling paintings and rich furnishings, demonstrated the level of craftsmanship and attention to detail that would be maintained throughout the project. The gardens presented their own set of challenges. Lenentre's design called for the creation of formal parterres, elaborate fountain systems, and carefully planned vistas that would extend for miles in every direction. The marshy terrain had to be completely reshaped, requiring the movement of enormous quantities of earth and the installation of drainage systems that would prevent the gardens from reverting to their natural state. The fountain systems alone required engineering expertise that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with 17th century technology. The machine de Marly, a massive hydraulic pumping system, was constructed to supply water to the palace and gardens. This complex mechanism, powered by 14 water wheels, could lift water over 500 feet from the Seine River to the reservoirs at Versailles. The engineering achievement was so remarkable that it became a tourist attraction in its own right. The workforce required to maintain the construction was almost as complex as the building itself. Workers had to be housed, fed, and supervised. A small town grew up around the construction site, complete with shops, taverns, and services needed to support the thousands of people involved in the project. The social and economic impact of the construction extended far beyond the palace itself, transforming the entire region around Versailles. The first phase of construction established both the scale and the standards that would guide the project for decades to come. By 1668, it was clear that Versailles would be unlike any other royal residence in Europe. The combination of architectural magnificence, technological innovation, and artistic achievement was creating something entirely new, a palace that would serve not just as a residence, but as a symbol of royal power and French cultural achievement. What challenges would emerge as the project expanded beyond even these ambitious beginnings? And how would the architects and craftsmen adapt to meet the Sun King's ever-growing vision? The morning of March 15, 1678, dawned crisp and clear at Versailles, and Jules Hardouin-Mansart stood surveying the greatest challenge of his architectural career. At 32 years old, he had just been appointed as the new chief architect of the palace, inheriting the massive project from Louis Lavoie, who had died 2 years earlier. The task before him was nothing short of revolutionary: to transform the already impressive palace into something that would dwarf every other royal residence in Europe. Hardouin-Mansart's appointment marked a new phase in the construction of Versailles. where Lvov had focused on creating a harmonious expansion of the original hunting lodge. Hartmann Mansart would be responsible for the truly monumental additions that would define the palace's final form. His first major commission was the creation of the Hall of Mirrors, a gallery that would become the most famous room in the palace and one of the most celebrated architectural achievements of the Baroque period. The Hall of Mirrors would replace a terrace that Lvov had designed to connect the king's and queen's apartments. This terrace, while pleasant enough, struck Louis XIV as an inadequate solution for what needed to be the grandest space in his palace. The king wanted a room that would dazzle visitors with its magnificence while serving as a suitable setting. For the most important state ceremonies, Hartmann Mansart's design would exceed even these ambitious expectations. The construction of the Hall of Mirrors required the demolition of the existing terrace and the creation of an entirely new structure. The work began in 1678 and would continue for 6 years, involving some of the most skilled craftsmen in France. The hall would stretch 240 feet in length, with 17 arched windows facing the gardens and 17 mirror-clad arches reflecting their light. The engineering challenges were formidable. The new structure had to support not only its own weight, but also the elaborate decorative elements that would adorn every surface. The mirrors themselves represented a triumph of French manufacturing. The technique of producing large, flat mirrors had only recently been perfected, and the French had managed to break the Venetian monopoly on this technology through a combination of industrial espionage and innovative manufacturing techniques. The 357 mirrors used in the hall were among the largest ever produced, and their installation required the development of new mounting systems that could support their weight while allowing for the thermal expansion and contraction that would affect the palace's structure. Charles Lebrun's decorative program for the Hall of Mirrors was equally ambitious. The ceiling would be covered with elaborate paintings celebrating the achievements of Louis XIV's reign, particularly his military victories and diplomatic triumphs. The execution of these paintings required the coordination of dozens of artists working under Lebrun's direction, each contributing their specialized skills to the overall composition. The work was so complex that it required the development of new techniques for painting on such a large scale and at such heights. The logistical challenges of the construction were staggering. The palace was occupied and functioning throughout the construction period, requiring careful coordination to ensure that building work did not interfere with court life. Materials had to be transported through occupied areas of the palace, often at night, to minimize disruption. The noise and dust generated by construction work had to be contained, requiring the development of new techniques for managing large-scale building projects in occupied structures. The workforce required for the Hall of Mirrors alone numbered in the hundreds. Master glaziers worked alongside skilled carpenters, metalworkers, and decorative artists. The installation of the mirrors required the development of specialized lifting equipment and mounting systems. The painting of the ceiling required the construction of elaborate scaffolding systems that could support workers and materials while allowing access to every part of the vast surface. The completion of the Hall of Mirrors in 1684 marked a triumph, not just of architectural design, but of project management and technical innovation. The hall's first major use was for the reception of the Doge of Genoa, who had come to offer his city's submission to Louis XIV. The Doge's reaction to the hall's magnificence was recorded by court observers, who noted his obvious amazement at the splendor of the space and the technical achievement it represented. While the Hall of Mirrors was under construction, Hartmann Mansart was also overseeing the construction of the palace's 2 massive wings. The south wing, begun in 1678, would provide apartments for members of the royal family and important courtiers. The north wing, started in 1685, would house government ministers and their staffs. These wings would more than double the size of the palace, and create the vast U-shaped structure that would define Versailles. Architectural identity. The construction of the wings required the development of new techniques for managing large-scale residential construction. Each wing contained hundreds of rooms, each with its own specific requirements for heating, lighting, and decoration. The coordination of the work required unprecedented organizational skills and systems. Ardo and Mansart developed new approaches to architectural documentation and project management that would influence building practices for generations. The heating systems for the palace represented a particular challenge. The vast scale of the building and the need to maintain comfortable temperatures throughout the winter required innovative approaches to heating technology. The palace's fireplaces numbered in the hundreds, and the chimney systems were so complex that they required their own specialized maintenance staff. The consumption of firewood was enormous, requiring the establishment of vast supply chains and storage systems. The decoration of the new wings required the coordination of hundreds of artists and craftsmen. Each room had to be designed and decorated according to strict protocols that reflected the rank and importance of its intended occupant. The hierarchy of decoration was carefully maintained, with the richest materials and most elaborate artistic programs reserved for the most important rooms. This system required not just artistic skill, but also diplomatic sensitivity, as any perceived slight in the decorative treatment of a room could have serious political consequences. Then the construction of the wings also required the development of new techniques for integrating old and new construction. The existing palace had to be modified to accommodate the new wings while maintaining structural integrity and textural harmony. This required careful engineering analysis and the development of innovative connection systems that could transfer loads between structures built at different times and with different techniques. The workforce required for the construction of the wings was drawn from throughout France and beyond. Master craftsmen were recruited from the major cities, while common laborers were hired locally. The seasonal nature of much of the work meant that the workforce fluctuated dramatically, swelling during the summer building season and contracting during the winter months when works costable. The financial cost of the construction continued to grow as the project expanded. The palace was consuming an ever larger portion of the royal budget, requiring new approaches to financing and project management. The king's determination to maintain the highest standards of quality and craftsmanship meant that costs could never be the primary consideration, but the financial pressures were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The completion of the major structural work on the wings in the 1690s marked another milestone in the transformation of Versailles. The palace had grown from a modest hunting lodge to a complex of unprecedented scale and magnificence. The architectural achievement was remarkable, but it was only the foundation for the even more ambitious projects that would follow. What new challenges would emerge as the focus shifted from structural construction to the creation of the elaborate garden systems that would complete the Sun King's vision? The autumn of 1698 found André Lantrey, now 75 years old, standing on the steps of the palace's garden facade, surveying the vast landscape that had consumed much of his life's work. Stretching before him for miles in every direction lay the most ambitious garden project ever attempted, a complete transformation of the natural landscape that would create a new relationship between architecture and nature, between human ambition and the natural world. The gardens of Versailles represented far more than decorative landscaping. They were a manifestation of the Sun King's vision of absolute power extending over every aspect of the natural world. The project had required the movement of entire forests, the creation of artificial lakes and waterways, and the development of hydraulic systems that pushed the boundaries of 17th-century engineering. The result was a landscape that appeared natural while being completely artificial, a perfect metaphor for the absolutist monarchy that Louis XIV was constructing. The transformation of the marshy terrain around Versailles had begun in earnest. In 1662, when Lantre first presented his comprehensive plan for the gardens, the project would eventually cover over 2,000 acres, incorporating not just formal gardens, but also forests, lakes, and carefully planned vistas that would extend the palace's influence over the surrounding countryside. The scale of the undertaking was so vast that it required the development of entirely new approaches to landscape design and construction. The formal gardens closest to the palace were designed according to strict geometric principles that reflected the order and rationality that Louis XIV sought to impose on his kingdom. The parterres, with their intricate patterns of clipped boxwood and colorful flowers, were laid out with mathematical precision. Every sightline was carefully calculated to create specific visual effects, and every element was positioned to contribute to the overall composition. The gardens were, in effect, an outdoor extension of the palace's interior decorative program. The construction of the formal gardens required the complete reshaping of the terrain. The natural slope of the land was modified through extensive grading work that moved thousands of cubic yards of earth. The marshy areas were drained and filled, while new water features were created to provide focal points for the garden design. The work was so extensive that the original topography of the site was completely obliterated, replaced by a landscape that existed solely to symbolic purposes of the palace. The water features of the gardens represented some of the most sophisticated hydraulic engineering of the period. The fountains, pools, and cascades required a constant supply of water under pressure, a challenge that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with 17th-century technology. The solution was the machine de Marly, a complex system of pumps and pipes that could lift water from the Seine River to the reservoirs at Versailles. The engineering achievement was so remarkable that it became a wonder of the age, attracting visitors from throughout Europe who came to marvel at this triumph of human ingenuity over natural limitations. The machine de Marly consisted of 14 water wheels, each 36 feet in diameter, that powered a complex system of pumps and pistons. The entire mechanism was housed in a massive building that became a monument to technological achievement. The system could lift over 3,000 cubic meters of water per day to a height of over 500 feet, supplying not just the palace and gardens, but also the numerous smaller palaces and fountains scattered throughout the estate. The construction of the machine de Marly required the coordination of engineers, mechanics, and skilled craftsmen from across Europe. The project represented the cutting edge of hydraulic technology, incorporating innovations that would influence engineering practice for generations. The complexity of the system was such that it required a permanent staff of technicians and mechanics to maintain its operation. The sound of the great wheels turning became a constant presence in the daily life of Versailles, a mechanical heartbeat that powered the artificial paradise Louis XIV had created. The botanical program of the gardens was equally ambitious. Lanatre worked with Jean-Baptiste de la Quintine, the king's chief gardener, to create plant collections that would showcase species from around the world. The kitchen gardens alone covered over 25 acres and produced exotic fruits and vegetables that had never before been grown in France. The cultivation of these plants required the development of new techniques for greenhouse construction and climate control, making Versailles a center for botanical innovation as well as architectural magnificence. The orangery, designed by Hardouin Mansart and completed in 1686, represented the pinnacle of greenhouse design. The massive structure, built into the slope below the palace, could house over 1,000 orange trees and other exotic plants during the winter months. The engineering challenges were formidable. The building had to provide adequate light and ventilation, while maintaining the temperatures needed for tropical plants. The solution was a masterpiece of architectural engineering, with enormous windows and innovative heating systems that created a controlled environment for the king's botanical collections. The Maintenance of the gardens required a workforce that numbered in the thousands. During the peak growing season, over 1,500 gardeners worked to maintain the parterres, fountains, and forest areas. The work was highly specialized, with different teams responsible for different aspects of the garden's maintenance. The topiary. Work alone required dozens of skilled craftsmen who could shape and maintain the elaborate sculptural hedges that decorated the formal areas. The seasonal rhythm of garden. Maintenance created a complex logistical challenge. The tender plants had to be moved into protective structures each winter, a process that required careful planning and coordination. The orange trees, which numbered in the hundreds, had to be transplanted from their summer positions in the gardens to their winter quarters in the orangery. This annual migration required specialized equipment and teams of workers who had developed expertise in handling these valuable plants. The cost of maintaining the gardens was staggering. The water system alone required constant attention and repair. As the complex machinery of the machine de Marly was subject to frequent breakdowns. The replacement of worn parts required the services of skilled mechanics and the importation of specialized materials. The ongoing costs of garden maintenance often exceeded the original construction expenses, making Versailles one of the most expensive royal residences in European history. The gardens also served as a testing ground for new approaches to landscape design that would influence garden architecture throughout Europe. The principles developed at Versailles, the integration of architecture and landscape, the use of water as a design element, and the creation of carefully planned vistas would be copied and adapted in royal gardens from England to Russia. The influence of Lantré's work extended far beyond France, helping to establish the French formal garden as the dominant style for royal and aristocratic landscaping. The completion of the major garden elements in the 1690s marked the culmination of one of the most ambitious landscape projects ever attempted. The transformation of the marshy terrain around Versailles into a paradise of geometric perfection represented a triumph of human will over natural limitations. The gardens had become a living symbol of the Sun King's power, demonstrating his ability to reshape the natural world according to his vision. The gardens also served practical purposes. Beyond their symbolic significance, they provided venues for the elaborate court ceremonies that were central to Louis XIV's system of royal authority. The carefully planned spaces could accommodate thousands of courtiers during major festivities, while the numerous smaller gardens and groves provided intimate settings for more private royal functions. The integration of ceremonial and practical functions made the gardens an essential component of the palace's role as the center of French political and social life. The workforce required to maintain the gardens had created a complex community. Around Versailles, gardeners, mechanics, and specialized craftsmen had established families and businesses that depended on the palace for their livelihoods. The seasonal nature of much of the work meant that the population of Versailles fluctuated dramatically throughout the year, creating unique challenges for housing and provisioning this workforce. The botanical collections at Versailles had also become a center for scientific research and education. The cultivation of exotic plants had led to advances in botanical knowledge and horticultural techniques that benefited agriculture throughout France. The kitchen gardens served as experimental plots where new varieties of fruits and vegetables were tested and developed. The scientific dimension of the garden project reflected the Enlightenment ideals that were beginning to influence French intellectual life. The completion of the gardens had created a landscape that was both natural and artificial, beautiful and functional, symbolic and practical. The achievement represented the pinnacle of 17th-century landscape design and engineering, but it had also created ongoing challenges that would test the resources of the monarchy for generations to come. As the 17th century drew to a close, Versailles had been transformed from a modest hunting lodge into the most spectacular royal residence in Europe. The palace and gardens represented the culmination of decades of construction and the coordination of thousands of skilled craftsmen, and laborers. The achievement was remarkable, but it was only the foundation for the even more complex social and political system that would develop within these magnificent walls. What new challenges would emerge as the focus shifted from construction to the daily operation of this vast complex? And how would the elaborate systems of court life adapt to the unique opportunities and constraints of this artificial paradise? The great clock in the Hall of Mirrors chimed 7 times on the morning of March 12, 1685. And throughout the vast palace of Versailles, an elaborate choreography of daily life began to unfold. In the king's antechamber, courtiers had been waiting since before dawn for the honor of witnessing the lever, the ceremonial awakening of Louis XIV. This daily ritual, repeated with mechanical precision every morning for decades, represented far more than the simple act of a king getting dressed. It was the foundation of a system of royal authority that would govern France for over a century. The lever ceremony exemplified the transformation of the most mundane human activities into elaborate displays of royal power. The king's daily routine had been codified into a series of precisely choreographed events, each governed by strict protocols that reflected the complex hierarchy of the court. Every gesture, every word, every movement had been invested with symbolic meaning that reinforced the divine nature of royal authority while creating opportunities for the distribution of royal favor and displeasure. The ceremony began each morning when the first valet de chambre entered the king's bedroom at exactly 8:30 a.m. and spoke the prescribed words, "Sire, it is time to get up." This simple announcement triggered a cascade of precisely timed events that would involve dozens of courtiers and servants over the course of the next hour. The king's awakening was not a private moment, but a public performance that demonstrated his accessibility to his subjects, while simultaneously reinforcing his elevated status above them. The first phase of the lever involved the king's most intimate servants. The first doctor and first surgeon were summoned to examine the king's health, a ritual that served both practical and symbolic purposes. The royal body was considered sacred, and its care required the attention of the most skilled medical practitioners in France. The examination also provided an opportunity for the king to demonstrate his physical vigor and moral authority, qualities that were considered essential to effective royal governance. The selection of courtiers who would be permitted to witness the lever was a complex process that reflected the intricate social hierarchy of Versailles. The privilege was carefully distributed according to rank, family connections, and current standing in the king's favor. The most prestigious positions were reserved for members of the royal family and the highest-ranking nobles, while lesser positions were allocated to courtiers whose presence served specific political or social purposes. The dressing of the king was perhaps the most elaborate aspect of the lever ceremony. Each article of clothing had to be presented to the king by the appropriate courtier, according to strict protocols that had been developed over decades. The honor of presenting the king's shirt, for example, was reserved for the highest-ranking noblemen present, and the order of precedence was so complex that it required the constant attention of specialized court officials, who maintained detailed records of rank and privilege. The ceremony of dressing served multiple purposes beyond the obvious necessity of clothing the king. It provided a mechanism for the distribution of royal favor, as the selection of courtiers to participate in the ceremony was closely watched and analyzed for signs of changing political fortunes. The intimate nature of the ceremony also created a sense of personal connection between the king and his courtiers, fostering loyalty and dependence that were essential to the maintenance of royal authority. The elaborate nature of the lever ceremony required the coordination of dozens of servants and courtiers, each with specific roles and responsibilities. The choreography was so complex that it required years of practice to master, and mistakes in protocol could have serious consequences for those involved. The ceremony had to be performed flawlessly, regardless of external circumstances, weather, conditions, or the king's personal health or mood. The physical setting of the lever ceremony was equally important to its symbolic impact. The king's bedroom, with its elaborate decorations and rich furnishings, provided a stage worthy of this daily performance. The bed itself, with its intricate carvings and costly fabrics, served as a throne from which the king could receive the homage of his courtiers. The room's architecture and decoration had been specifically designed to enhance the ceremonial functions that took place within its walls. The timing of the lever ceremony was crucial to the functioning of the entire court system. The king's awakening triggered a series of events that would structure the entire day's activities. Courtiers who had been granted the privilege of attending the lever would use this opportunity to request audiences, present petitions, or simply to demonstrate their continued presence at court. The ceremony served as a daily renewal of the social contracts that bound the nobility to the crown. The lever ceremony was followed by the petty lever, a more intimate gathering that included only the most privileged courtiers. This second ceremony provided opportunities for more personal interactions between the king and his closest advisors, while still maintaining the formal protocols that governed all aspects of court life. The distinction between the grand lever and the petty lever was carefully maintained, as it provided another mechanism for the distribution of royal favor and the reinforcement of social hierarchy. The breakfast that followed the lever ceremony was itself a carefully orchestrated event. The king's dietary preferences, the selection of foods, and the manner of their presentation all reflected the symbolic importance of royal consumption. The meal was prepared by specialized servants who had been trained in the precise requirements of royal cuisine, and the serving of the food followed protocols that were as elaborate as those governing the dressing ceremony. The conclusion of the morning ceremonies marked the beginning of the king's official day. But the elaborate protocols that had governed his awakening would continue to structure every aspect of his activities. The lever ceremony had served its purpose of demonstrating the king's accessibility while reinforcing his elevated status, of distributing royal favor while maintaining social hierarchy, and of transforming mundane human activities into displays of divine authority. The system of ceremonies that governed daily life at Versailles required the constant attention of specialized court officials who maintained detailed records of protocol and precedents. The complexity of the system was such that it required its own bureaucracy, with officials responsible for different aspects of court life and ceremonial requirements. The maintenance of these systems required not just knowledge of tradition, but also the ability to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving the essential symbolic functions of royal ceremony. The lever ceremony was just one of dozens of daily rituals that structured life at Versailles. The king's meals, his walks in the gardens, his attendance at religious services, and his evening entertainments were all governed by similarly elaborate protocols. The cumulative effect of these ceremonies was to create a daily rhythm that reinforced royal authority while providing multiple opportunities for the distribution of royal favor and the demonstration of courtly hierarchy. The courtiers who participated in these ceremonies had to master not just the specific protocols, but also the subtle art of reading the king's moods and intentions. Success at court required the ability to interpret the slightest changes in ceremony or protocol, as these often signaled important shifts in royal policy or favor. The ceremony thus served as a form of political communication, conveying information about the king's intentions while allowing courtiers to demonstrate their loyalty and understanding. The transformation of daily life into elaborate ceremony represented one of the most significant innovations of Louis XIV's reign. The system created at Versailles would influence court life throughout Europe and establish patterns of royal behavior that would persist for centuries. The ceremonies had succeeded in their primary purpose of enhancing royal authority, but they had also created a complex social system that would prove both remarkably durable and ultimately vulnerable to the changing political and social forces that would reshape European society. What impact would these elaborate ceremonies have on the thousands of courtiers who participated in them? And how would the daily rhythms of Versailles shape the broader culture of French aristocratic society? The Duchess of Burgundy stood before her mirror on a Tuesday morning in November 1697, watching as her lady-in-waiting carefully arranged the elaborate headdress that would identify her rank and status to every person she encountered that day. The Duchess was one of approximately 3,000 nobles who lived permanently at Versailles, part of a carefully orchestrated social system that had transformed the French aristocracy from potential rivals to the crown into dependent ornaments of royal power. The decision to move the court permanently to Versailles in 1682 had created an unprecedented concentration of noble families in a single location. This gathering of the aristocracy served multiple purposes for Louis XIV. It allowed him to monitor potential threats to his authority, created a system of mutual surveillance among the nobles themselves, and transformed the competitive energies of the aristocracy into elaborate displays of loyalty and cultural refinement rather than political opposition. The daily life of a courtier at Versailles was governed by a complex web of social obligations, ceremonial requirements, and subtle competitions for royal favor. The Duchess's day would begin with careful attention to her appearance, as every detail of dress and grooming would be scrutinized by hundreds of observers, who were expert in reading the subtle signals of fashion and favor. The choice of fabrics, the arrangement of jewelry, and even the selection of patches for her face all carried encoded messages about her current standing at court. The housing arrangements at Versailles reflected the intricate hierarchy of the court with mathematical precision. The most prestigious apartments were located near the king's quarters, providing both proximity to royal power and the convenience of participation in the most important ceremonies. The Duchess, as a member of the royal family, occupied a suite of rooms that included not just her private chambers, but also reception areas, where she could hold her own court and receive the homage of lesser nobles. The apartments of courtiers varied dramatically in size and quality, from the magnificent suites reserved for princes of the blood to the cramped chambers allocated to minor nobles who had been granted the privilege of residence at Versailles. The distribution of these accommodations was a constant source of anxiety and competition among the courtiers, as changes in housing assignments were carefully monitored for signs of shifting royal favor. The Duchess's morning routine included receiving visits from other court ladies, a process that required careful attention to the protocols of precedence and courtesy. The order in which visitors were received, the length of their audiences, and the degree of familiarity displayed in their interactions all conveyed important information about relationships and relative status within the court hierarchy. These social calls were not mere pleasantries, but essential components of the political and social networks that governed court life. The elaborate dress requirements of court life represented a significant financial burden for noble families. The Duchess's wardrobe included hundreds of gowns, each designed for specific occasions and seasons. The cost of maintaining an appropriate wardrobe was so high that many noble families bankrupted themselves in their efforts to maintain their position at court. The king's own clothing budget was enormous, and his daily changes of costume provided a model that courtiers felt compelled to emulate. The breakfast gatherings that followed the morning ceremonies provided opportunities for more informal social interaction, but even these apparently casual moments were governed by subtle protocols. The Duchess would receive selected guests in her chambers, offering chocolate or coffee while engaging in the carefully controlled conversations that constituted court social life. The topics of conversation were carefully chosen to avoid controversial subjects while providing opportunities for the display of wit and learning. The promenade through the gardens was one of the most important social events of the day. The Duchess would join the elaborate procession of courtiers as they walked through the formal gardens, their movements carefully choreographed to maximize opportunities for displaying their costumes and engaging in the subtle forms of social communication that governed court life. The gardens provided a magnificent stage for these daily performances, with the carefully planned sightlines and architectural features enhancing the visual impact of the assembled courtiers. The dining arrangements at Versailles reflected the same attention to hierarchy and ceremony that governed every other aspect of court life. The Duchess would dine according to her rank, with the seating arrangements, menu selections, and service protocols all carefully designed to reinforce the social order. The king's own meals were elaborate public performances, with hundreds of courtiers gathering to witness the royal consumption of carefully prepared dishes. The afternoon entertainments provided opportunities for the display of accomplishments and talents that were considered essential to court life. The Duchess was expected to demonstrate proficiency in music, dancing, and conversation, skills that had been carefully cultivated through years of education and practice. The entertainments also provided opportunities for the subtle forms of competition and alliance building that were central to court politics. The evening ceremonies that concluded each day were perhaps the most elaborate of all court activities. The Duchess would participate in the complex rituals surrounding the king's retirement, ceremonies that required the coordination of hundreds of participants and the precise execution of protocols that had been refined over decades. The evening ceremonies provided a final opportunity for the display of loyalty and the reinforcement of social hierarchy before the cycle began again the following morning. The constant surveillance that characterized court life created a unique form of social pressure that shaped every aspect of noble behavior. The Duchess, like all courtiers, was constantly aware that her actions, words, and even facial expressions were being observed and analyzed by rivals and potential allies. This intensive scrutiny had created a culture of extreme self-control and theatrical performance that extended far beyond the formal ceremonies of court life. The financial pressures of court life were enormous and constantly increasing. The Duchess's family, despite their high rank, struggled to maintain the lifestyle required by their position at Versailles. The cost of appropriate clothing, the maintenance of suitable retinues, and the provision of gifts and entertainment for other courtiers created expenses that often exceeded the income from their traditional estates. Many noble families had been forced to sell lands or seek royal pensions to support their court lifestyle. The education of noble children at Versailles reflected the specialized requirements of court life. The Duchess's own children were being trained in the complex protocols and social skills that would be essential to their future success at court. This education included not just traditional academic subjects, but also the subtle arts of reading social situations, managing personal relationships, and navigating the complex political currents that flowed through the palace. The health consequences of court life were significant and often serious. The Duchess, like many courtiers, suffered from the effects of the rich diet, sedentary lifestyle, and constant stress that characterized life at Versailles. The palace's medical facilities were excellent by the standards of the time, but they were constantly busy treating the various ailments that afflicted the court population. The seasonal rhythms of court life created their own patterns of activity and responsibility. The Duchess's schedule varied significantly between the active, social season and the quieter periods when the court's activities were reduced. The summer months brought additional challenges, as the palace's location and architecture made it uncomfortably hot during the warmest weather, requiring adaptations in clothing, ceremonies, and daily routines. The transformation of the French aristocracy from a feudal warrior class into a court-based service nobility represented one of the most significant social changes of the early modern period. The Duchess embodied this transformation, her daily life shaped entirely by the requirements of court service rather than the traditional responsibilities of noble landholding. The system created at Versailles had succeeded in neutralizing the political threat posed by the aristocracy, but it had also created new forms of dependence and vulnerability. that would have profound consequences for the future of the French. Monarchy. How would the elaborate system of court life adapt to the changing political and social pressures that would challenge the foundations of royal authority in the decades to come? The Swiss guards at the gates of Versailles processed over 6,000 visitors on the morning of September 15, 1715. As news of the Sun King's death spread throughout Europe and delegations arrived to pay their respects to the new monarch, the palace that had been designed as a stage for the performance of absolute monarchy now faced the challenge of maintaining its elaborate systems of ceremony and protocol during a period of unprecedented political uncertainty and social change. The death of Louis XIV, after a reign of 72 years, marked the end of an era. But the machinery of court life that he had created continued to operate with mechanical precision. The lever ceremony proceeded on schedule, now awakening 5-year-old Louis XV. While the thousands of courtiers, servants, and officials who depended on the palace for their livelihoods adjusted to the realities of a new reign under the guidance of a regent. The regency of Philippe d'Orléans, which would govern France until Louis XV reached his majority, faced the enormous challenge of maintaining the elaborate systems that had been created. During the previous reign, while adapting to changing political and economic circumstances, the palace had become not just a residence but a vast machine for the production of royal authority, employing thousands of people in roles that ranged from the most exalted court positions to the most piecemeal mundane maintenance tasks. The complexity of the palace's daily operations was staggering. The kitchens alone employed over 300 people, from master chefs who prepared the elaborate meals for the royal family to scullery maids, who cleaned the thousands of dishes required for daily service. The preparation of a single royal meal required the coordination of dozens of specialists, each responsible for different aspects of the culinary production. The procurement of ingredients involved supply chains that extended throughout France and beyond, bringing exotic spices from Asia, fine wines from the best vineyards, and the freshest produce from carefully selected suppliers. The laundry operations at Versailles processed thousands of items daily, from the elaborate court costumes that required specialized cleaning techniques to the simple linens used by the palace's vast staff. The wash houses were located away from the main palace to prevent the noise and odors of the cleaning process from disturbing court activities. But the logistics of transporting soiled and clean linens throughout the vast complex required careful coordination and substantial manpower. The heating systems that kept the palace comfortable during the long winter months represented one of the most challenging aspects of daily operations. The palace contained over 2,000 fireplaces, each requiring daily attention from specialized servants who understood the complex requirements of different types of fires. The consumption of firewood was enormous, requiring the maintenance of vast woodlands and the coordination of supply chains that brought fuel from forests throughout the region. The water systems that supplied the palace and its famous fountains required constant maintenance and adjustment. The machine de Marly, despite its remarkable engineering, was subject to frequent breakdowns that required the immediate attention of skilled mechanics. The palace maintained a permanent staff of hydraulic engineers whose sole responsibility was ensuring the reliable operation of the water systems. The failure of these systems would not only affect the comfort of the palace's inhabitants, but would also prevent the operation of the fountains that were central to the garden's design. The security arrangements at Versailles were equally complex and demanding. The palace was protected by multiple layers of guards, from the Swiss guards who controlled access to the main gates to the specialized units that provided personal protection for members of the royal family. The coordination of these security forces required careful planning and constant vigilance, as the palace was simultaneously a private residence, a government center, and a public space that welcomed thousands of visitors daily. The stables at Versailles housed over 2,000 horses, making them among the largest in Europe. The care and training of these animals required the services of hundreds of grooms, trainers, and veterinarians. The horses were not merely transportation. They were essential to the elaborate ceremonies and entertainments that were central to court life. The daily exercise and training of the horses required careful scheduling to ensure that appropriate mounts were available for the various activities. Planned throughout the day, the maintenance of the palace's elaborate decorations and furnishings required the constant attention of skilled craftsmen and conservators. The hundreds of paintings, tapestries, and sculptures that adorned the palace were vulnerable to damage from heat, humidity, and the constant activity of court life. The palace maintained workshops where skilled artisans could repair damaged items and create new pieces as needed. The administration of this vast complex required a bureaucracy that rivaled that of many small countries. The palace employed dozens of administrators, accountants, and clerks who managed everything from payroll to procurement to scheduling. The coordination of the various departments required sophisticated management systems and careful attention to the complex hierarchies that governed palace operations. The seasonal variations in court life created additional challenges for the palace's management. The summer months brought increased activity as the weather made outdoor entertainments more attractive, while the winter months required different types of heating and lighting arrangements. The palace had to be prepared for sudden changes in the royal schedule, as the king's decisions about travel or entertainment could affect the work of hundreds of employees. The elaborate ceremonies that were central to court life required the coordination of dozens of specialists who understood the complex protocols and traditions that governed royal behavior. The palace employed masters of ceremony, protocol officers, and etiquette experts who ensured that every aspect of court life conformed to the established standards. The training of new personnel in these complex requirements was an ongoing process that required considerable time and expertise. The economic impact of the palace extended far beyond its immediate workforce. The palace's procurement needs supported thousands of suppliers throughout France, from the silk producers who provided fabrics for court costumes to the craftsmen who created the elaborate furnishings that decorated the royal apartments. The palace had become a major economic engine that supported entire industries and regional economies. The cultural influence of Versailles extended throughout Europe and beyond. The palace had become a model for royal residences throughout the continent, with rulers from Russia to Spain attempting to recreate the magnificence and ceremonial complexity of the French court. The artistic and architectural innovations pioneered at Versailles influenced design and decoration throughout the European aristocracy. The educational functions of the palace were equally important to its role in French society. The palace served as a training ground for the next generation of French aristocrats, who learned the complex social and political skills required for success in royal service. The palace's libraries, art collections, and musical establishments provided resources for the education of young nobles, while also serving as centers for artistic and intellectual innovation. The palace's role as a center of French government meant that it was constantly involved in the major political decisions that shaped the kingdom. The various councils and committees that advised the king met in the palace's government quarters, while the elaborate ceremonies of court life provided opportunities for the informal discussions and negotiations that were often more important than formal diplomatic proceedings. The transformation of Versailles from a simple hunting lodge into the most complex royal residence in Europe represented one of the most remarkable achievements of the early modern period. The palace had succeeded in its primary purpose of enhancing royal authority and controlling the French aristocracy. But it had also created a system of extraordinary complexity and expense that would prove increasingly difficult to maintain. As France faced new political and economic challenges, the machinery of majesty that had been perfected at Versailles during the reign of Louis XIV would continue to operate for decades to come. But the changing political and social conditions of the 18th century would test its adaptability and resilience. The elaborate systems that had been created to support absolute monarchy would face new challenges as ideas about government, society, and individual rights began to transform European political culture. What pressures would ultimately challenge the sustainability of this elaborate system? And how would the palace adapt to the revolutionary changes that would sweep through France in the decades to come? Marie Antoinette stood at the window of her private apartments on the morning of May 10, 1774. Watching the elaborate funeral procession of Louis XV wind its way through the courtyards of Versailles. At 19 years old, she was now Queen of France, thrust into a role that would require her to navigate the complex politics of an increasingly unstable kingdom while maintaining the elaborate ceremonial traditions that had defined the French monarchy for over a century. The young queen had arrived at Versailles for years earlier as a 14-year-old Austrian archduchess, brought to France to cement the alliance between the Habsburg and Bourbon dynasties. Her marriage to the future Louis XVI had been arranged for purely political reasons. But the personal and cultural challenges she faced at the French court would prove far more complex than the diplomatic considerations that had brought her to France, the financial crisis that would ultimately destroy the French monarchy was already evident when Marie Antoinette became queen. The costs of maintaining Versailles, combined with France's involvement in expensive foreign wars, had created a mounting debt crisis that would dominate political discussions throughout her reign. The palace that had been designed to demonstrate the wealth and power of the French monarchy had become a symbol of the fiscal irresponsibility that was bringing the kingdom to the brink of bankruptcy. Marie Antoinette's personal expenses became a particular focus of criticism as the financial crisis deepened. Her love of elaborate clothing, jewelry, and entertainment seemed to many French citizens to epitomize the callous disregard for public welfare that they associated with the royal court. The queen's gambling debts, which were substantial even by the standards of Versailles, provided ammunition for critics who argued that the royal family was squandering the nation's resources on frivolous pleasures. The queen's construction of the Petit Trianon, a smaller palace within the grounds of Versailles, was intended to provide her with a retreat from the suffocating protocols of court life. However, the project became another source of criticism, as the costs of construction and the exclusivity of the queen's private entertainments were seen as evidence of her disconnection from the struggles of ordinary French citizens. The pastoral fantasy that she created at the Petit Trianon, complete with a mock farm and rustic village, struck many observers as a particularly offensive form of aristocratic escapism. The queen's Austrian origins made her a convenient target for criticism during periods of tension between France and Austria. Her correspondence with her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, was carefully monitored by French officials who suspected her of divided loyalties. The Queen's efforts to influence French foreign policy in ways that would benefit Austria provided her enemies with evidence of treasonous behavior that would later be used against her during the Revolution. The elaborate court ceremonies that had been designed to enhance royal authority began to work against the monarchy as economic conditions deteriorated. The daily spectacle of royal luxury at Versailles contrasted sharply with the hardships experienced by ordinary French citizens, creating resentment that would eventually explode into revolutionary violence. The Queen's participation in these ceremonies, particularly her role in the elaborate dining rituals that were central to court life, made her a visible symbol of royal excess. The Queen's relationship with her husband, Louis XVI, was initially distant and formal, reflecting the arranged nature of their marriage. However, as the political crisis deepened, their partnership became increasingly important to the survival of the monarchy. The king's indecisiveness and reluctance to make difficult decisions placed additional burdens on the Queen, who was forced to take a more active role in political affairs. Despite her lack of preparation for such responsibilities, the birth of the Queen's children particularly the Dauphin Louis-Joseph in 1781, provided temporary relief from the criticisms that had surrounded her early years at Versailles. The royal family's domestic life became a subject of intense public interest, with the Queen's role as a mother providing opportunities for more positive public relations. However, the children also became targets for critics who questioned the legitimacy of the royal succession and the fitness of the royal family to govern France. The diamond necklace affair of 1785 represented a turning point in the Queen's public image. Although she was completely innocent of any wrongdoing, the scandal involving a fraudulent purchase of an extremely expensive diamond necklace was widely blamed on the Queen's supposed greed and extravagance. The affair provided a focal point for all the criticisms that had been building against the Queen, and her reputation never recovered from the damage inflicted by this incident. The Queen's attempts to reform court life at Versailles reflected her growing awareness of the political dangers facing the monarchy. She tried to reduce the elaborate ceremonies that had become associated with royal excess. But these efforts were often misunderstood by both courtiers and the public. The conservative elements of the court saw her reforms as attacks on traditional French values, while critics outside the palace dismissed them as insufficient gestures that failed to address the fundamental problems of the monarchy. The calling of the Estates General in 1789 marked the beginning of the end for the old regime at Versailles. The Queen's role in the political negotiations that preceded this historic assembly was limited by her gender and her foreign origins. But she was nevertheless blamed for many of the monarchy's failures. The elaborate ceremonies that had once enhanced royal authority now seemed like anachronistic rituals that were disconnected from the real needs of the French people. The Queen's isolation at Touvet became increasingly apparent as the political crisis deepened. The elaborate court system that had been designed to surround the monarchy with loyal supporters had instead created a bubble of privilege that separated the royal family from the realities of French society. The Queen's limited contact with ordinary citizens made it difficult for her to understand the depth of popular discontent or to respond effectively to the challenges facing the monarchy. The transformation of Versailles from a symbol of royal power into a target of revolutionary anger reflected the broader changes that were reshaping French society. The palace that had been designed to demonstrate the permanence and stability of the monarchy had become a monument to the failures of the old regime. The Queen's presence at Versailles made her a lightning rod for all the resentments and frustrations that had been building against the system of absolute monarchy. The Queen's attempts to maintain the dignity and traditions of the monarchy while adapting to revolutionary pressures created impossible contradictions. The elaborate protocols that had governed court life for over a century could not be easily abandoned. But their continued observance seemed increasingly inappropriate as France descended into political chaos. The Queen found herself trapped between the expectations of her traditional role and the demands of a revolutionary age. The financial costs of maintaining Versailles continued to drain the royal treasury even as the monarchy's political authority collapsed. The thousands of courtiers, servants, and officials who depended on the palace for their livelihoods created enormous ongoing expenses that the government could no longer afford. The Queen's efforts to reduce these costs were hampered by the complex web of privileges and traditions that had grown up around the court system. The Queen's personal relationship with the palace itself became increasingly complex as the political crisis deepened. Versailles had been her home for over 15 years, and she had invested enormous emotional energy in creating spaces that reflected her personal taste and provided refuge from the pressures of court life. The prospect of losing this carefully constructed world added a personal dimension to the political crisis that made it even more difficult for her to make the compromises that might have saved the monarchy. What forces would ultimately make it impossible for the Queen and her family to maintain their position at Versailles? And how would the revolutionary transformation of French society affect the palace that had been the symbol of royal power for over a century? The Assembly of Notables convened in the Salon of Hercules at Versailles on February 22, 1787, bringing together representatives of the French nobility, clergy, and high magistrates to address the mounting financial crisis that threatened to bankrupt the kingdom. The irony of holding this crucial meeting in the most magnificent room of the palace that had largely created the fiscal emergency was not lost on the assembled delegates. Discussions would reveal the depth of the challenges facing the French monarchy. Finance Minister Charles Alexandre de Coligny presented a comprehensive reform program that would have fundamentally altered the Expenian French tax system and reduced the privileges that had long exempted the wealthy from bearing their fair share of the kingdom's expenses. The proposed reforms were radical by the standards of the old regime, but they represented a recognition that the traditional sources of royal revenue were no longer sufficient to meet the kingdom's needs. The Palace of Versailles, with its enormous operating costs and symbolic importance, stood at the center of these fiscal challenges. The Assembly's rejection of Coligny's reforms revealed the fundamental contradiction that would ultimately destroy the monarchy. The palace had been designed to demonstrate royal power and to co-opt the nobility through the distribution of privileges and honors. But these same privileges had created a system of tax exemptions and special benefits that made it impossible to address the kingdom's financial problems. The nobles who had been transformed into courtiers at Versailles were unwilling to sacrifice their traditional privileges even when the survival of the monarchy was at stake. The dismissal of Coligny and his replacement by Loménie de Brienne marked the beginning of a period of increasingly desperate attempts to solve the fiscal crisis without addressing its fundamental causes. The new finance minister tried various expedients, including the sale of royal properties and the imposition of new taxes. But these measures proved insufficient to address the scale of the problem. The Palace of Versailles, with its vast art collections and extensive lands, represented a potential source of revenue. But the political and symbolic costs of disposing of royal assets made this option extremely difficult to pursue. The decision to call the Estates General in 1789 represented an admission that the traditional systems of royal government were no longer capable of addressing the kingdom's problems. The announcement of this historic assembly, which had not met since 1614, created excitement and anxiety throughout France as citizens prepared to participate in a process that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the monarchy and the people. The Palace of Versailles was chosen as the site for this momentous gathering, a decision that would have profound consequences for both the Assembly and the palace itself. The preparations for the States General required extensive modifications to the palace and its grounds. The Salle des Menus Plaisirs, a large hall that had been used for court entertainments, was converted into a meeting space for the Assembly. The logistics of accommodating over 1,100 delegates, along with their servants and supporters, strained the resources of the palace and the surrounding town. The contrast between the magnificent surroundings and the serious business of political reform created a dramatic backdrop for the events that would unfold. The opening ceremony of the Estates General on May 5, 1789, was conducted with all the traditional pomp and ceremony that had characterized royal functions at Versailles. The king, queen, and members of the royal family appeared in their most elaborate costumes, while the delegates were required to wear clothing that identified their estate and status. The ceremony emphasized the traditional hierarchies of French society, but it also revealed the tensions and contradictions that would soon explode into revolutionary violence. The transformation of the Third Estate into the National Assembly on June 17, 1789, marked a revolutionary moment that fundamentally altered the nature of French government. The delegates' decision to assume sovereign authority challenged the traditional basis of royal power and created a new form of political legitimacy based on popular representation rather than divine right. The Palace of Versailles, which had been designed to demonstrate the absolute authority of the monarchy, now became the stage for the assertion of popular sovereignty. The tennis court oath of June 20, 1789, took place in a modest sports facility that contrasted sharply with the elaborate halls of the palace. The delegates pledged to create a new constitution for France, represented a direct challenge to the old regime and its symbols. The choice of venue was symbolic as well as practical, as the delegates were asserting their independence from the royal court and its traditions, while remaining physically present at the seat of royal power. The storming of the Bastille on July sent shockwaves through the court at Versailles and marked the beginning of the violent phase of the French Revolution. The news of the prison's capture and the massacre of its defenders reached the palace within hours, creating panic among the courtiers and servants who had depended on the stability of the old regime for their livelihoods. The symbolic importance of the Bastille's fall was immediately understood by those at Versailles, who realized that the foundations of royal authority were crumbling. The great fear that swept through rural France in the summer of 1789 had a direct impact on the palace and its inhabitants. Many of the noble families who had estates in the affected regions received reports of peasant uprisings and the destruction of manor houses. The violence in the countryside made it clear that the revolution was not confined to Paris or the political assemblies but was spreading throughout the kingdom. The Palace of Versailles, with its vast estates and privileged position, became a potential target for revolutionary anger. The abolition of feudalism and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, both enacted in August 1789, fundamentally altered the legal and social foundations of French society. The Palace of Versailles, which had been built to celebrate and maintain the hierarchical society of the old regime, now found itself in a country that had officially rejected the principles of noble privilege and royal absolutism. The ceremonies and protocols that had governed court life for over a century were suddenly anachronistic relics of a discredited system. The October days of 1789 brought the revolution directly to the gates of Versailles. The march of thousands of Parisian women to the palace, demanding bread and political reforms, demonstrated the failure of the traditional barriers that had protected the royal family from popular pressure. The invasion of the palace by angry crowds marked the end of Versailles as a secure refuge for the monarchy and forced the royal family to confront the reality of their declining authority. The forced removal of the royal family from Versailles to Paris on October 6, 1789, marked the effective end of the palace's role as the center of French government. The king's reluctant departure, accompanied by a hostile crowd that had invaded his private apartments, symbolized the collapse of the old regime and the triumph of popular sovereignty. The palace that had been designed to demonstrate the permanence and stability of royal power had become a monument to the fragility of absolute monarchy. The departure of the royal family left Versailles in an uncertain state. The thousands of courtiers, servants, and officials who had depended on the court for their livelihoods faced an uncertain future. Many of the nobles who had lived at the palace for decades were forced to abandon their apartments and seek new sources of income. The complex social and economic system that had grown up around the court began to collapse as the revolution eliminated the privileges and positions that had sustained it. The palace itself became a symbol of the revolution's triumph over the old regime. The elaborate apartments that had housed the royal family and their courtiers were open to public tours, allowing ordinary citizens to see for themselves the magnificence and excess that had characterized the monarchy. The transformation of Versailles from a private royal residence into a public monument represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between the French people and their government. The artistic and cultural treasures of Versailles faced an uncertain fate as the revolution progressed. The palace's vast collections of paintings, sculptures, and decorative arts represented enormous value that could potentially be sold to address the nation's financial problems. However, the symbolic importance of these treasures as representations of French cultural achievement complicated efforts to dispose of them. The debate over the fate of the palace's artistic heritage reflected broader questions about the relationship between cultural preservation and revolutionary change. The maintenance of the palace itself became a significant challenge as the revolution eliminated the traditional sources of funding for royal residences. The complex systems that had been developed to heat, clean, and maintain the vast structure required enormous resources that the new government struggled to provide. The palace's deteriorating condition became a visible symbol of the old regime's decline and the challenges facing the revolutionary government. What would be the ultimate fate of this magnificent Toulouse palace as the revolution moved toward its most radical phase? And how would the symbol of royal absolutism adapt to the democratic ideals that were reshaping French society? The last candles were extinguished in the Hall of Mirrors on the evening of October 5, 1789, as the remaining servants of Versailles prepared to abandon the palace that had been the heart of French royal power for over a century. The great rooms that had witnessed the most glorious moments of the monarchy now stood empty and silent, their elaborate decorations reflecting moonlight through windows that would soon be shuttered against an uncertain future. The departure of the royal family had triggered a cascade of abandonment throughout the palace. The courtiers who had competed for apartments near the royal quarters packed their belongings and departed for their provincial estates or foreign exile. The servants who had maintained the elaborate systems of court life found themselves without employment or purpose. The palace that had housed thousands of people at the height of its glory was reduced to a skeleton staff of caretakers who struggled to maintain the vast complex with severely reduced resources. The National Assembly's decision to remain at Versailles after the royal family's departure created a strange juxtaposition between the symbols of the old regime and the institutions of the new. The delegates continued to meet in the converted entertainment hall, surrounded by the artistic celebrations of royal power that decorated the palace walls. The contrast between the democratic deliberations of the assembly and the monarchical splendor of their surroundings provided a daily reminder of the revolutionary transformation taking place in French society. The palace's art collections became a particular focus of attention as the revolutionary government sought to address the nation's financial crisis. The paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects that filled the palace rooms represented enormous value that could potentially be converted into desperately needed revenue. However, the process of cataloging and evaluating these treasures revealed the complexity of determining their ownership and the difficulties of disposing of objects that had been created specifically for their current locations. The transformation of Versailles from a royal residence into a national museum was first proposed in 1790 by the revolutionary government. This innovative concept would preserve the palace's artistic heritage while making it accessible to the French people who had been excluded from its splendors under the old regime. The museum project represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between cultural treasures and political power, as objects that had once served to reinforce royal authority would now be used to educate and inspire democratic citizens. The practical challenges of maintaining the palace during the revolutionary period were enormous. The heating systems that had kept the vast structure comfortable required constant attention and substantial fuel supplies. The roof repairs needed to prevent water damage were expensive and technically complex. The gardens, which had been maintained by hundreds of gardeners, began to deteriorate as the revolutionary government struggled to provide adequate funding for their upkeep. The fate of the palace's workforce became a humanitarian crisis as the old regime collapsed. Thousands of skilled craftsmen, servants, and officials who had depended on the court for their livelihoods faced unemployment and hardship. The revolutionary government's attempts to provide alternative employment were hampered by the economic chaos that accompanied the political transformation. Many former palace employees were forced to emigrate or seek work in entirely different fields. The symbolic importance of symbolic made it a target for revolutionary violence and vandalism. The palace's elaborate decorations, which had been created to celebrate royal power, were seen by many revolutionaries as offensive reminders of the old regime's oppression. The destruction of royal symbols throughout the palace was both spontaneous and organized, as revolutionary crowds sought to eliminate the visual representations of the monarchy they had overthrown. The auction of the palace's movable furnishings in 1793 marked one of the most dramatic moments in the revolutionary transformation of Versailles. The elaborate furniture, tapestries, and decorative objects that had been created by the finest craftsmen in France were sold to the highest bidders, dispersing the palace's treasures throughout Europe and beyond. The auction attracted buyers from across the continent, many of whom were eager to acquire souvenirs of the fallen French monarchy. The palace's role as a symbol of royal excess made it a popular destination for revolutionary tourists who came to see for themselves the magnificence that had been maintained at the expense of the French people. The guided tours that were organized through the palace's apartments provided opportunities for revolutionary education, as visitors were encouraged to contemplate the contrast between royal luxury and popular suffering. The palace had become a monument to the failures of the old regime and the justice of the revolutionary cause. The attempts to find alternative uses for the palace reflected the revolutionary government's struggle to deal with the enormous structure they had inherited. Proposals included converting the palace into a school, a hospital, or a military barracks. But the building's elaborate decorations and specialized architecture made it poorly suited for most practical purposes. The palace's very magnificence, which had been its greatest strength under the monarchy, became a liability in the democratic age. The preservation of the palace's artistic heritage became a matter of national pride as the revolutionary government recognized the cultural significance of what had been created at Versailles. The establishment of the Museum of French History in 1837 by King Louis Philippe represented a compromise between the desire to preserve the palace's artistic legacy and the need to acknowledge the revolutionary transformation of French society. The museum would celebrate French achievement while avoiding the political implications of royal restoration. The palace's gardens faced particular challenges during the revolutionary period. The elaborate water systems that had been the marvel of the old regime required constant maintenance and substantial financial resources. The Machine de Marly, which had supplied water to the palace's fountains, fell into disrepair as the revolutionary government struggled to maintain the complex mechanical systems. The formal gardens, which had been maintained by hundreds of workers, began to return to a more natural state as funding for their upkeep was reduced. The international reputation of Versailles made it a subject of fascination for foreign visitors who came to witness the aftermath of the French Revolution. The palace's transformation from a symbol of royal power to a monument to revolutionary change provided a powerful illustration of the political upheavals that were reshaping European society. The guided tours that were available to foreign visitors became a form of revolutionary propaganda, demonstrating the benefits of democratic government over monarchical rule. The palace's survival through the revolutionary period was far from certain. The radical phases of the revolution saw calls for the complete destruction of Versailles as a symbol of royal oppression. The palace's preservation was due largely to the recognition of its artistic and historical significance, as well as the practical difficulties of demolishing such a massive structure. The decision to preserve rather than destroy Versailles represented a mature approach to revolutionary change that recognized the value of cultural heritage, even when it was associated with a rejected political system. The legacy of Versailles as a symbol of royal absolutism would continue to influence French political culture long after the revolution had ended. The palace's magnificence and the system of court life it had supported would be remembered as both an artistic achievement and a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. The revolutionary transformation of Versailles from a royal residence to a national museum represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between cultural treasures and political authority that would influence museum development throughout the world. The story of Versailles had come full circle from the modest hunting lodge of Louis XIII to the magnificent palace of Louis XIV, from the center of royal power to the symbol of revolutionary change. The palace that had been built to demonstrate the permanence and stability of the French monarchy had become a monument to the power of popular sovereignty and the inevitability of political change. The transformation of Versailles reflected the broader transformation of French society as the hierarchical world of the old regime gave way to the democratic ideals of the modern age. The Palace of Versailles stands today as a testament to the power of human ambition and the fragility of political systems. From its origins as a simple hunting lodge in the marshes southwest of Paris to its transformation into the most magnificent royal residence in Europe, Versailles embodies the contradictions and complexities of the old regime in France. The palace's story reveals how architecture and ceremony could be used to reinforce political authority, but also how that same magnificence could become a symbol of the excesses that ultimately led to revolutionary change. The four stories we have explored: humble beginnings under Louis XIII, the grand transformation under Louis XIV, the elaborate court life that defined French aristocratic culture, and the decline and fall during the revolutionary period illustrate the complex relationship between power, culture, and society in early modern France. The palace that was built to demonstrate the permanence of royal authority became a symbol of the inevitability of political change, a reminder that even the most magnificent human creations are subject to the forces of history and social transformation.